Welcome to By All Means Necessary Real Recovery Talk. I'm Marco Murillo, and I'm a grateful recovering addict. On today's episode, I want to talk about my personal experience, strength, and hope. I'm 48 years old. I was born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada. My parents were divorced when I was 5, and my dad moved out to San Francisco. So I didn't have my father, my biological father, growing up when I was a kid or a teen. And that really took a toll on me mentally. I idolized a man that I actually wasn't around. And, I started to lie about things about my father to my friends. And I started to believe those lies. I started to believe the things that I was telling people that weren't really true to help me cope with the situation that he basically left my mother and I. So my dad was an alcoholic, and he was addicted to drugs. My whole life, he was in active addiction. I had a chance to go see my father when I was about 11 years old, and I spent the summer out in San Mateo, California with him. And this is the first time that I really, spent time with him. And he was a big Scotch drinker, and he did cocaine. So if you can imagine me, I'm, idolizing this man. I couldn't wait to get on the plane to go see him. I then, witnessed his behaviors, and I was young, so I wasn't really familiar with what he was doing in terms of the drugs or the drinking, but he became this beast, and he decided to put his hands on me, put his fists on me. So again, I'm like 11 years old. He does like a 4 to 6 punch combination on me, like on my body, and he knocked me out. He basically knocked me to the ground. And this happened a couple of times during that summer. I didn't tell my mom when I got back to Las Vegas. I didn't tell anybody. Thinking about it now, I probably thought that it was my fault. And I didn't want him to get in trouble, and I wanted to be able to go see him again. And so I did. I went out, and I saw him the next summer, and it happened again. And I didn't tell anybody. I remember I came back, and I was crying at my grandmother's house, my mom's mother's house. And my mom told me that she wouldn't send me out there anymore. So my relationship with my dad was really rough. He would at times he told me that he was sending me a plane ticket to go out to San Francisco for my birthday, and the ticket never came. Just shit like that. He wasn't supposed to be a father. He was a really smart guy. He was an engineer. He had his own company. He flew Cessna planes on his downtime, but he had a problem. He was an addict. And it took me to get into recovery to understand who my father was. So my mother actually remarried. I had a stepfather. He's a great guy. He did his best. He came into a fucked up situation because I'm wanting my biological father. There's that blood thing. But he was a great guy. They did their best with me. I didn't use drugs at any point through high school. We drank. That's what we did. I frowned upon drugs, even looking at my father doing that stuff. Las Vegas was, I was a pretty good kid. Las Vegas is pretty rough. It's very transient. There's not a lot of people that were born and raised in Las Vegas. It's a 24-hour town. This is like, I grew up there when I was young in the 80s. And I got into fights and stuff like that, but nothing really big. I was a pretty good kid. Like I said, I frowned upon drugs. I went to college, and that's the first time that I ever smoked weed. And it was something to where I did one. I smoked one joint. And for me, that was it. That allowed me to feel really good. I kept chasing that high. I actually moved back to Las Vegas, and right now I'm a private chef. So I started in a hotel in Las Vegas. There was a 5-star. There was a 5-year apprentice sous chef program in Las Vegas, and I was the first first guy to start this program at this hotel in Las Vegas. And I remember that I had a roommate, and he was the second candidate to start this program. And we worked at this hotel together. And his sister was a cocktail waitress at this hotel. And one day she came over, and she smoked weed with us. We drank together, but she brought this stuff over, and she said, "Oh, you guys got to try this. It'll give you energy. It'll be good for work. I do it when I work. It's great." And it was actually speed. So I remember I tried it, and I threw up, and I got sick, and I was like, "Oh, I'm never going to touch that stuff again." And then I ended up doing it again the next day, and I was hooked. I started doing it at work, and I was young, so I was 22 years old. I thought that, that would help me. We were working long hours, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I started meeting people in the kitchens, and they were doing that same drug or doing other drugs. So it was part of like the fraternity, if you will. Like there was a lot of drug use in the back of the house, that's what they call it, in the kitchens. And for 5 years, I worked at this casino, and I was using, and I got a chance to actually move to New York and work for this celebrity chef. And I figured, I'm going to go to New York, and I'm not going to do drugs, and I'm going to be okay. I'm not going to partake in that anymore. And I ended up going to New York, and it got worse. I worked at these 3-star restaurants in Manhattan, and it was prevalent. It was all over. It was all over the kitchens. There was a lot of cocaine, and I was really embedded in this lifestyle, and I really didn't know that I had a problem. I remember looking in the mirror one day when I was doing the drugs, and I was like, this is part of my life. I figured I'd just keep continuing to do this. And I actually met my wife when I moved to New York, and she's a chef as well. And we ended up having 2 children. We opened up a restaurant, a catering company, and a wine bar in Brooklyn, New York. And my drug usage was heavy. And the ironic thing about it is that she didn't know for 13, 14 years that we were together that I was doing cocaine. She knew that I smoked and I drank, but I hid this from her. And that, to me, is something, when you're an addict, you're a master manipulator. You're a scammer. You're like a con man. Like anything to get that next fix, you'll do anything. And, looking back at it, I idolized my father, but as I got older, I promised myself that I would never be like him. And I would never be a father to my children like he was to me. And I was actually following his footsteps. I never left my wife. I never left my children. I was physically there, but mentally, I was gone. I wasn't there. I was using every day. Like I said, I used for 19 years, and my clean date is March 3rd, 2016, so I'm coming up on 7 years clean with no alcohol, nothing. And we packed up, we closed the restaurant and the catering company, and we moved to South Florida, and I got a job as a private chef. And once again, I thought that, relocating, I would come out here, have a clean start, no drugs, and that lasted for maybe about 2 months when I came out here. And then I found somebody that I went to school with, and I started picking back up in Fort Lauderdale, started using again. And this was my bottom. I was basically living in Jupiter, Florida, and I was a corporate executive chef for a catering company in Miami. So that's like over an hour and a half drive each way. And I was getting a synthetic drug shipped to me from Las Vegas. They called it ice, which was something like speed and crystal and cocaine all mixed together. And I was actually buying it, and they were shipping it through the postal mail for me. And I was getting this shipped to the office of the catering company that I was working at. That's how messed up my thinking was, that I'm getting drugs shipped to my job. And I'm doing this drive 6 days a week, back and forth every day. I'm pretty much up for days. And this is the end. This was my rock bottom. I never went to jail. I never was arrested. I never overdosed. By God's will, none of those things happened to me. I went home and I crashed and I slept for 2 days, and on the second day, my wife came in and she's like, okay, what the fuck is wrong with you? And I decided to tell her I was addicted to cocaine. I'm addicted to speed. And I remember she left the bedroom. And on the next day I woke up and my bags were packed, and she drove me to rehab here in South Florida. And I remember I was about to get out of the car, and she grabbed my hand and she goes, I want to tell you something. And I thought like maybe she was going to tell me, good luck, I love you, you got this. But she actually looked at me and she said, you can't relapse. This is your first and last chance, or I'll leave you and you won't see me or the kids for the rest of your life. And that was my first and only time that I went to rehab. I got into rehab, and I concocted this plan of breaking out of rehab because, mind you, for 19 years, I used pretty much every day, every other day for 19 years. And all of a sudden, you're in this confined space where you're not using anymore. And I pretty much went crazy the first week, and I had this plan of breaking out. I didn't go through it. I was in rehab one day, and we're working out outside, and this guy comes up to me, and He's like this big African-American guy, and he comes up to me, and it didn't look like he was part of the residents in the rehab. And he came up to me and he goes, "Hey, Marco." And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "Hey, how you doing?" And I recognized him. It was Vance Johnson. He was a wide receiver for the Denver Broncos. And I didn't know his story. I just remember watching him play football. And he sat down with me for about a half hour, and he told me his story, that he actually went to that rehab. And it was actually his last rehab he went to. And he was clean, and he told me all the destruction and everything that he did in his addiction years. And he told me about, he knew about my wife and my children, and he told me that, I have a kingdom, and I'm the king, and I have my queen, and I have my seeds. And basically, he's telling me that the disease of addiction is like the devil, and it comes in and it just rapes and pillages and it kills your whole family. And he's like, "Is that what you want to happen?" Because that's what's happening now, and that's what will happen. Inevitably, that will be the last thing that's going to happen to you and your family. And I said, no, no, not at all. I didn't know that I was an addict. And I still keep in contact with him. I think a couple of days later, they had this thing in rehab called H&I, Hospitals and Institutions, where they have people that went to the rehab, and they come back and they hold a meeting, and it was called Narcotics Anonymous. And so they had these two guys come in, and they held this meeting, and I didn't know what Narcotics Anonymous was. I went to this meeting, I sat down, and they have these sayings in the beginning of the meeting, which really hit home. And they had a guy that was sharing his experience, strength, and hope, and a guy that was holding the meeting. And the guy that shared his experience, strength, and hope basically was telling like everything I did in my life in active addiction. And they held up this blue book. It was called Narcotics Anonymous. And after the guy shared, they opened up the meeting, and you could raise your hand and you could share about where you were at in the present moment. And after the meeting, everybody left, and I went up to these two guys, and I said, I didn't even know that I had a problem. I didn't even know that I was an addict. And I didn't even know what Narcotics Anonymous was. And I thank them for everything that they did, because they opened up a world to me in terms of hope. And one of the guys gave me the blue book, their Narcotics Anonymous book, and I read the whole book when I was in rehab. And they told me, to try to go to 90 meetings in 90 days when you get out of rehab, to get a sponsor, and to work the steps and really get into Narcotics Anonymous. And I remember I got out of rehab, and it was tough, because I remember the second day that I got out, I had called my wife, and I told her that I was driving back into rehab, that, I wanted to go back in that cocoon. I wanted to go back because I couldn't take life out on the street. I didn't know how to live. Mind you, like I used cocaine for 19 years, and now all of a sudden I'm 35 days clean, and I'm out in the streets by myself. I can do whatever I want. And I didn't think I could handle it. And, she talked me out of it. She's like, you're strong. You could do this. So I was unemployable. I had lost my job with that with that catering company in Miami, I got fired. So I'm fresh out of rehab, no job, and Narcotics Anonymous says to do 90 meetings in 90 days. And I believe that I did over 270 meetings in 90 days because I had no idea what to do. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how to live life clean. So I would just go to these meetings all around South Florida and just sit there and listen to these people share. Listen to what they were saying. And everything was relatable. And I took little things from what people were saying and I would put it in my phone, like little sayings, little slogans, things that people said that helped them stay clean. And there was this one guy at this Why Not New meeting, and he became my first sponsor. I asked him to sponsor me. And he was very spiritual. He was really down-to-earth guy. He had a lot of clean time. And, I approached him, and he asked me, because when you raise your hand in the meetings, you introduce yourself by your first name. And I would say, I'm Marco, I'm a drug addict. And my sponsor, he looked at me, he goes, there's so much hate. He goes, we know you're a drug addict, but why don't you say that you're a grateful recovering addict? And I did. I started saying that, and I started believing it, because that life that I lived was horrendous, and I didn't know how to stop. And, people, it's interesting because they'll say, why don't you just stop? Well, I didn't know how to. It was a part of my life, and I thought that's what I was supposed to be doing. And there's two things. At this point, I started to realize who my father was, because as I was getting clean, I was learning about myself, but I was actually learning about my father, because he was in active addiction his whole life. And the things that he did, the negative things that he did towards my mom and myself, or himself, or to others, was part of who he was as being an addict. So I started working the steps with my sponsor. I started learning more about myself, how to live clean one day at a time. And I started to learn and forgive my father. And there's a thing that I learned in the rooms, and it's called break the cycle, where, I definitely didn't want to treat my children how I was treated, so I wanted to break that cycle. And I think I did a good job. I really think that I did my best, and I'm still doing my best to stay clean. It's not easy. But to show my children, to lead by example, to show them that, you can make mistakes, and there's that whole thing about if it's hereditary, the disease of addiction, or if it's something about the trauma that you had when you were young, or if it's a bit of both, where those two things end up assisting you in terms of using drugs to forget or suppress the pain or the trauma that you've had. And I really feel that, the whole idea of doing the steps for me was to learn how to be a productive human being, a productive member of society, a productive husband, a productive father, a productive employee. Because, when you're in active addiction, I was a narcissist. I still have character defects clean, but I'm working to get better. In active addiction, all I thought about, I didn't care about anything. I didn't care about myself. I didn't care about my wife, my children. I was there physically. I wasn't there mentally. All I cared about was getting that next drug. And manipulating her, my wife, so she didn't know about this for years, was very hard on her, was very hard on my children. There's a whole side of addiction that there's the people that you hurt, the people that have nothing to do with addiction, but it comes into their lives because of the addict. And that's why I wanted to really start this podcast to talk about different things about addiction, to hear people's stories about their trauma, about when they actually got clean, how they got clean, and how they're staying clean. And also to talk about the experiences of the other side of addiction with wives, children, parents, and what they go through, and how their life is affected by somebody that's in addiction and that's somebody that's in recovery. So, it's a daily program for me. I don't want to go back to that lifestyle. I want to keep breaking the cycle. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunities I had to go to rehab. I'm not using this podcast to say like I was a victim. Nobody put a gun to my head and told me to use drugs. I want to make that clear. I chose to use drugs. I chose that lifestyle. It wasn't something where it was put on me. I made the decision. And I made the decision to stop using. And to this day, stay clean. So thank you for letting me share.